What's your I finally met my online friend horror story? Story 1. Back during World of Warcraft's second expansion, there was this guy in my guild I'd become friends with mostly through other friends. We talked more and more over time and became fairly close. He had this crazy roommate, and I could hear the guy sometimes, especially when something went wrong during a raid. He'd scream and throw fits. He was pretty awful sounding. My friend told me he wasn't just loud and obnoxious, but verbally and sometimes physically abusive too. I had my own apartment, so I said, "You know what, come stay with me, just long enough to get you on your feet and into a place that's safe." He showed up at my place with a trash bag full of his stuff and a laptop. I set him up in the apartment and started trying to help him find a job. Well, he did not want a job. He did not get a job either. He sat in my apartment day after day, eating my food and slowly draining my savings. No matter how hard I tried to get him motivated, he would just dig in his heels and somehow become more sedentary. Eventually, I told him he had to go. I couldn't afford to keep him there. He was just couch surfing. I spoke to some people and eventually pieced together that his method of securing a new, temporary place was playing on the sympathies of his friends to convince them he was in a terrible living situation. It just worked really well on me, because he had that loud, obnoxious roommate to play off of. He wound up calling a nearby relative to come and get him, I think his aunt. I don't know what he told her I supposedly did, but I have never seen a more venomous look from someone in my life. As far as I know, he moved in with his sister and brother-in-law after that, but frankly, I don't care where he ended up. He also stole a bunch of my stuff, first and last time I do anything like that. Story 2. I never actually met the guy, but spoke to him on the phone. We met on MySpace when I was in college and exchanged email addresses when we realized we lived in the same town. Eventually, I gave him my phone number and made plans for him to call me. When he did, his voice creeped me out. It was how I imagined a serial killer would sound. By the time I got past it and was comfortable talking to him on the phone, I started noticing other red flags. Whenever I brought the neighborhood up, he changed the subject. At one point, I asked him what his favorite restaurant on the boulevard was, and he hedged, so I made up a restaurant that I said was my favorite. He immediately said that was his favorite too, and that he especially loved one of their dishes. He went on and on about this wonderful place that didn't exist, and there wasn't a similar one in town, so he couldn't be confused. I called him out on the fact that he'd obviously never been to my neighborhood. Turns out, he didn't even live in the same state as me. Story 3, I met a guy online, we really got on, and he came over a few times so we could hang out. I did find him attractive and tried to hint that I was into him. Note, I can't flirt to save my life. But nothing ever happened. After a few dates, he suddenly vanished offline. No social media, he wasn't answering texts or emails, nothing. I thought he'd ghosted me. After 6 months, he reappears. I asked him where he'd been, and he said, "I don't want to talk about it." A few weeks after, there was a fad where people were Googling their names and posting humorous stories they had found about similar people with their name. Mine was about a ship that had my initials. And I started to Google friends' names just out of boredom, morbid curiosity, Googled his name, and found a local news story from his area. One of those crime and courts things that he had been done for statutory rape of a minor, online grooming, and had his computer and phone seized as evidence. Story 4. This is way back in the mid-90s. Bulletin board systems were all the rage. I made friends with this guy from North Carolina. He was friends with a bunch of us from my dorm, mostly females, which should probably have been a red flag, but I was extremely naive at the time. A couple months in, he mentioned he was coming to our state for a wedding and asked if he could come by our college to meet everyone. It was agreed he'd sleep in my dorm room, since my roommate was almost never around. Now, there was no discussion or thought of sex, but I was pretty excited to meet this guy and see if he was as funny and charming as he was online. Well, day arrives, dude shows up. I should mention that I and all my college friends were 18. Or 19. This guy was 24. Or so he said. Guy looked like, and I'm not exaggerating, a cancer patient. Pale, gaunt features. Long, greasy, pale, blonde hair, except where he was bald on top, and just generally looked like he was about to die, or he was dressed as a ghoul for Halloween. He insisted on hugging all of us. I was trying to remind myself that looks don't matter, and that he was a cool guy, despite his very unsettling appearance. But then, when we all started hanging out, things just got worse. He was asking really invasive questions of all of us, making weird comments to whatever was said, just all around creepy and distressing. I was sitting on the floor with another friend and actively rocking back and forth from discomfort. I lied and said I had hurt my back and that sleeping on the floor helped, because that night he kept insisting we could share my tiny twin college bed. Nope. Last time I ever met anyone from that site. Story 5. I don't know if it's a horror story, but it is how I ended up where I live now. I played World of Warcraft for years with a pretty regular group, got to know them offline, and at one point, 2 of them, a couple, invited me to move across the country. At the time, I didn't have anything tying me to where I was, so I packed up and moved. got out here, moved in with my friends, and everything seemed okay. My buddy was a long-haul driver, so he was always gone for days at a time. His girl would try to set me up multiple times with two of her friends at the same time, one in Minnesota. I ended up having a hard time finding work for a while, finally got a job though, and was putting some money away while helping watch their kids. Out of nowhere, one day my buddy accuses me of trying to fool around with his girl. Nothing had ever happened, but I had noticed her spending more and more time in my room when he wasn't there. I knew his history, and his previous relationship had ended after she cheated with a friend of his. He wouldn't listen, so I got kicked out without any warning, and they stole about $1,000 worth of my stuff and later moved. Ultimately, it all worked out for me. Cut the friend and his girl out of my life completely and moved on. Now I have a good job here, wife and kids. Story 6. A couple of years ago, this girl messaged me on Reddit saying she really connected with a comment I made about first seeing the ocean because she had just gone through a similar experience. She was going to come down to Chicago to visit a friend of hers and asked for suggestions of things to do. I gave her a bunch, and then we kept talking and finding out we had more and more in common. We eventually started talking over the phone and text messages, and when she came down, we went out for burgers and beer. We kept talking every day after that, and I was really starting to like her. She said she wanted to come down to Chicago again, and if she could stay with me. I told her, of course, and a few weeks later, she was here for Saturday and Sunday. Really, it was mostly Sunday because she got in late on Saturday and fell asleep on my couch. The next day, we went to the zoo and had a really amazing day. After that, we came back to my place and decided to go to the brewery nearby, which made a beer that had her name in it. We went there and then ended up bar hopping through until we ended up near the dive bar by my apartment. We drank and played pool there, and eventually grabbed some to-go beers and headed back. I asked if she wanted to see the place by the river I like to go and drink and think. We sat and eventually started making out, and decided to head back to my apartment. We hooked up and then the next day went to the south side to get breakfast at a place she really liked near her friend's apartment before she had to drive back. We kept talking after that, and I was planning on coming up to visit her in Detroit. But then one day she just ghosted me out of nowhere. Not as horrible as some other stories, but it was really shitty for me because I actually really liked this girl, and to this day, I have no idea why she stopped talking to me. Story 7. We were friends of a friend in high school but hadn't seen each other in 15 years when she Facebook friended me. After about 3 years of back and forth messaging, sending memes, etc., she came to town and was really eager to meet up. So I agreed to get coffee with her. I show up to the coffee place and she is half an hour late and looks nothing like her pictures online anymore. I almost didn't recognize her. She sits down and monopolizes the conversation for an hour. We visit a local attraction where she gets in free with me and spends money in the gift shop, then says she'd really like to grab some food. We ride over to a restaurant and she orders a huge amount of food and eats it all. The check comes, and the waitress asks if it's together or separate, and she immediately says together, smiling. I assume this means she is paying for me, since I drove her to the restaurant and got her into the attraction for free. The waitress brings the check and puts it on the table. She leaves it untouched for like 10 minutes. I finally am like, hey, do we need to split it? Mind you, I had gotten just some fries, whereas she racked up like a $30 bill. She goes, oh, you have to get this one. I don't have any more money. I freak out because I don't have $30. I end up texting my husband, asking him to transfer some money into my account from his. I try to leave and she starts crying that her brother kicked her out and her parents paid for a hotel for the rest of her stay. But she has no money to get back because she spent it at the gift shop. Mind you, we are in our 30s. I reluctantly give her a ride back, about 10 miles out of my way, and drop her off with a bye. She hits me with a barrage of Facebook messages about how I am a horrible person for embarrassing her and should be ashamed of my behavior. I blocked and deleted her like a house on fire. Story 8. I met a guy through Match.com. After countless exchanges, we went on a date. He showed up handsome, well-dressed, and successful. We went to a beautiful French restaurant. During dinner, he claimed to feel bad and asked if we could not talk, then proceeded to ask for the check right after the entrees arrived. I asked the waiter to box my meal. When we got into his car, he said, let's go to my house, have coffee and listen to music. I said, no thank you, and please take me home. He drove in the opposite direction. After a 5-minute argument, we went to Starbucks for coffee, and he yelled at me because he couldn't smoke in the cafe. Just then, a friend texted and invited me to her party a few miles away. I figured this was my out, so I asked him to go with me. We were there for about an hour, and he said he was ready to leave. I told him I was staying. He said, you're not leaving with me? I told him no. He then slapped me across the face in a room full of my friends, and no one saw it. I was shocked. He leaned in an inch from my face and said, what's wrong, cat? Got your tongue? He turned around and walked out. He then continued to leave me harassing messages, calling me names, and stalked me for the next 3 months. He'd show up at places he knew I would be. He would call me from other numbers and cry and ask me to go to counseling with him. He finally stopped. It ruined online dating for me forever. Story 9. I matched with a girl on Tinder and we agreed to meet up at a nearby coffee shop. When I arrived, I was sitting in the parking lot and noticed only 2 people in the coffee shop, some old guy and a girl who looked similar to the girl I matched with on Tinder. She didn't entirely look like the girl I matched with on Tinder, but she looked enough like her for me to pass it off as her using filters to make herself look better. I texted her that I'm here. When I did that, the old guy and the girl got their phones out at the same time and I got a text that said, I'm inside. I went inside and went up to the girl and said, hey, Melissa, right? She looked up from her phone, frowned up and said, no, wrong person. Right after she said that, the old guy tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, he gave me a toothy smile and casually said, howdy. I ran out like I was running from a killer. Story 10. When I was about 30 and living in NYC, a girl on OkCupid started messaging me. She said she was 21, a student at New York University, and was into anime and all sorts of other wonderful nerdiness. I should mention, I am part Asian, so online dating would get all the weeaboos. But what was strange was that her pictures looked like a model. It seemed like there was no way this red-headed model contacted me out of the blue. We started texting. She'd text me all the time and started sending pictures of her cat, her shoes, her fingernails, never a full shot of her, and then she started calling me. We would actually have great conversations, and it seemed like some parts of her stories were true. She shared an apartment with other girls, and she would interact with them, and I would hear them talk back during our conversations. However, the pictures of the redhead she sent me in the photo properties were pictures several years old, so definitely not her. I even had a female friend point out her fingernails were rounded, but the redheads were squared as evidence. Anyway, I pushed to meet her and she disappeared. The strangest part of the story was I would talk about this mystery, sometimes on other dates, and one of them had previously dated a writer, an Asian guy, and shared with me a short story he wrote about his experience with the same girl. That a redhead contacted him, started texting, calling, etc., then disappeared forever.